300 guests in the Obsidian's grand hall were raising their glasses when a girl in a kitchen uniform wandered into the middle of the party. Kendall Ashford, the second most powerful woman in the room, looked her up and down, then blocked her path in front of everyone. "Who let you in here? Pick up that napkin and get out." The girl bent down. The entire hall watched. No one said a word. Then a 72-year-old woman stood up from the VIP table. She walked straight through the crowd, took the girl's hand, and pulled her upright. She turned to Kendall, her voice not loud, but every word cutting clear across the silence, and what she said drained the color from Kendall's face in an instant. Remington Cross, Denver's most powerful underground boss, the man no one in this city dared look in the eye, stood just a few steps away. The glass in his hand hadn't even reached the table, because for the first time in his life, he watched his mother shield a complete stranger with a kind of authority that money could never buy. The girl had nothing. No name, no money, no power. She lived in a basement apartment, ate instant noodles every night, and counted every last coin toward a debt she might never finish paying. But 3 months ago, on an empty sidewalk, she had done something that no one in this room full of billionaires had bothered to do, and that single act would pull her into Remington Cross's underworld, where kindness could save a life, but could also get her killed. If this story touched your heart, hit like so more people can hear it. Share this video with someone you think needs this story today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way you see the world. A few hours before the party began, the top floor of the Obsidian was still silent. The VIP room sat at the end of the hallway, separated from the rest of the building by 2 layers of soundproof doors and by a man standing guard, a man whose name no one dared to ask. Inside that room, Remington Cross sat across from a middle-aged man in a gray suit, his hands resting on his thighs as he tried to keep his fingers from trembling. The man's name was Harlan. 3 months earlier, Harlan had borrowed money from Remington to save his sinking transportation company. The repayment deadline had long since passed. The money had not appeared, and now Harlan was sitting here, in a room where pale yellow light spilled across the dark wooden table, facing the man no one in all of Denver ever wanted to owe. Remington wasn't in a hurry. He poured liquor into 2 glasses, slowly, his hand as steady as if he were pouring morning tea. He pushed 1 glass toward Harlan, then settled back in his chair, his back against it, his eyes fixed directly on the face of the man opposite him without blinking. "Drink," Remington said. His voice was flat, neither rising nor falling, as though he were talking about the weather. Harlan picked up the glass. His hand shook so hard that the liquor sloshed over the rim and ran down his fingers. He tried to lift the glass to his mouth, but he couldn't bring himself to drink. Remington looked at the drop of liquor spreading across the table, then went on, still in that same calm voice. "I'll give you 1 more week. Not because I believe you'll pay, because I want you to have enough time to put the things that need arranging in order. Your wife and children, your papers, the things you don't want to leave unfinished." Harlan set the glass down, his eyes red. "Mr. Cross, I beg you. 1 week. Remington cut him off, his voice not a shade louder, yet Harlan fell silent at once. "That's all I can give you. Use it wisely." Harlan stood, lowered his head, then walked out of the room like a man who had just received a sentence and could no longer tell whether he was still alive or already finished. The door closed. Remington sat alone, finished his own glass, his face unchanged. Out in the hallway, Wyatt Brennan was waiting. Wyatt was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, and the only person besides Dorothy whom Remington trusted with his life. When Harlan passed by, Wyatt watched him go, then turned to Remington as he stepped out. "And if he doesn't pay?" Wyatt asked. Remington didn't turn back. He straightened his cuff and answered in a voice as light as wind. "Then he's had a week to say goodbye. More than my father ever gave anyone." Remington Cross was 33 years old. On the surface, he was the owner of Cross Holdings, a real estate corporation, and a chain of elite nightclubs stretching across Denver, with the Obsidian as its largest jewel. Beneath that surface, he had inherited from his father an underground empire that controlled most of the city's lending, protection, and shipping operations. His father, Malcolm Cross, had died 5 years earlier because he had trusted the wrong person, and Remington had received both a kingdom and the most expensive lesson of his life: trust no one. He lived by that rule. Everyone around him was measured by a single standard: usefulness. Those who served a purpose were kept. Those who no longer served one were discarded. Emotion was a luxury he didn't allow himself to possess. In his eyes, the world was divided into two kinds of people, the kind he needed and the kind whose names he didn't need to know. But there was one exception. One single exception that even Wyatt knew must never be touched, and that was Dorothy Cross, his mother. Dorothy was 72 years old, lived in a quiet house along the hillside, went to church every Sunday morning, and was the line Remington never crossed. Every command he gave could be brushed aside by her with a single sentence. Every wall he built around himself had one door, and only she had the key. Tonight, the Obsidian was hosting the 10th anniversary celebration of the corporation. The guests were the elite, the partners, the politicians. Remington had arranged everything with the same perfection with which he controlled everything in his life. But there was one detail outside the plan. Dorothy, who rarely attended parties and almost never stepped into the world her son ruled, had agreed to come tonight. She had told Remington on the phone that afternoon, her voice calm. 10 years. I should be there once. Remington didn't ask why. When his mother decided something, she didn't need to explain, and he didn't need to ask. He stood before the mirror in the dressing room behind the Obsidian, adjusted the collar of his suit, then stepped outside. Tonight would be a perfect night. He had controlled every variable, every risk had been calculated. Everyone on the guest list had been approved, but there was one person who wasn't on any list at all. A girl in a kitchen assistant's uniform, her hair tied up in a hurry, calluses still marking her hands, was stepping into the building through the rear employee entrance. At the same moment, Remington Cross stepped out of the dressing room on the top floor of the Obsidian, 6 blocks away. Paige Holloway was taking off her apron in the kitchen of a small diner tucked behind a row of cheap boarding houses on the outskirts of Denver. The evening shift ended at 9 o'clock. Paige stacked the chairs, wiped down the last table, then took her tips from the manager. A few crumpled bills, small and tired-looking. She counted them quickly and slipped them into her shirt pocket without changing expression. She was used to that number. It was always less than she'd hoped, and more than nothing, so she treated it as enough to keep going. Paige was 27 years old. She didn't have the habit of complaining about her life, because she'd never lived another one to compare it with. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 14. Her grandmother raised her in cramped rented rooms that were cold in winter, hot in summer, and short on everything all year round. Her grandmother died when Paige was 22, leaving behind a medical debt Paige was still paying month by month 5 years later, and a habit she couldn't break, always stopping when she saw someone on the road who needed help. Not because she was kind in some storybook way, but because she knew what it felt like when no one stopped for her. She walked back to her studio apartment in the basement of an old building. Calling it an apartment was generous. In truth, it was only a small room below street level, with just enough space for a bed, a cooking burner, and a narrow patch of floor where she could stand and turn around. She cooked instant noodles, sat on the bed to eat because she had no table, then opened her phone and began calculating. Tonight's tips, plus the wages from 2 shifts that week, minus rent, minus utilities. Whatever remained would go toward the medical debt. She tapped the calculator, stared at the number, then turned off the screen. Not enough. Just like every month, the $60,000 debt sat there like a mountain she was trying to climb with her bare hands, inching up a few inches each month, only to slide back down again because of interest and nameless bills. She didn't cry. She'd stopped crying over money a long time ago. Tears didn't pay debts, and no one was buying them anyway. Her phone buzzed. A message from the diner manager. There was an opening for a kitchen assistant at a large party at the Obsidian nightclub tonight. They needed extra help urgently, and the pay was double a regular shift. Paige looked at the wage amount, looked back at the debt bill lying on her bed, then sent back 2 words. "I'll take it." She stood, changed into the only clean uniform she had left, tied her hair neatly behind her head, and washed her face with cold water to wake herself up. She looked at herself in the mirror for 1 second, then stopped, because there was nothing there worth staring at for long. She stepped out of the basement apartment, climbed the stairs, and came out onto the sidewalk. Denver was chilly tonight. She pulled her thin coat close around her body and started walking toward downtown, where the Obsidian rose above the most expensive blocks in Denver, lit from the first floor to the rooftop, like a giant crystal she had never once stepped inside. She didn't know who owned that building. She didn't know that tonight her life would turn down a road she couldn't possibly foresee. All she knew was that she needed money, and someone needed dishes washed. That was enough to make her keep walking. The entire hall of the Obsidian still hadn't dared to make a sound. Dorothy Cross stood there, her hand gripping the hand of the girl in the kitchen assistant's uniform, and she didn't let go. She turned to look at her son. Remington stood a few steps away, his glass of liquor still in his hand, and across his face appeared something no one in that room had ever seen before, a surprise he hadn't managed to hide in time. He, the man who controlled every variable in his life, was watching his mother do something completely outside every calculation he had ever made. "Son," Dorothy said, her voice not loud, but every word was clear, as if she were speaking privately to Remington, though the entire hall could hear her. "Do you know who this girl is?" Remington didn't answer. He looked at the girl, looked at the kitchen uniform, looked at the calloused hands being held tightly by his mother, and he couldn't find an answer. Dorothy didn't wait for her son to respond. She told the story, briefly, in the voice of someone who had carried it inside her for 3 months, and now finally had a reason to speak it aloud. 3 months earlier, after Sunday morning church service, she had taken a walk alone along her familiar route. She liked that stretch of road because it was quiet, and because it was the only time of the week when no one followed her. No driver. No men from Remington. She had made it halfway down the road when her blood pressure dropped, her legs went weak, and she collapsed right there on the sidewalk. People walked past, Dorothy said, her eyes fixed straight on Remington, one after another. No one stopped. I was lying there on the curb, 72 years old, and people stepped over me as if they were stepping over a trash bag. She paused for one breath. The hall was so quiet that the sound of someone setting a wine glass down on a table could be heard. Then this girl came. Dorothy tightened her hold on Paige's hand. She was walking home after her shift, wearing a housekeeping uniform, so tired she looked ready to drop. But when she saw me lying there, she sat down. Sat down right there on the dirty curb beside an old woman she'd never met before. She called for an ambulance, kept me awake, and used a cloth to wipe the sweat from my forehead. From her pocket, Dorothy took out a small old handkerchief, its corner embroidered with the letter P in faded blue thread. She left this behind. I've kept it from that day until now. Dorothy turned to Kendall, the woman still standing there with every trace of color drained from her face. People crossed the street without looking. This girl sat down beside me on the curb. She didn't know who I was. She didn't need to know. That sentence fell into the banquet hall like a stone dropped into still water. Kendall Ashford, the woman who had just forced this girl to bend down and pick up a napkin in front of 300 guests, stood there and felt the eyes of the whole room pour onto her. The smile on her lips had vanished from the moment Dorothy stood up, and now, in its place, there was something sharp, cold, and struggling to stay hidden. Remington looked at Paige. He looked at her for a long time, as if he were trying to read a page written in a language he didn't know. This girl had saved his mother, and she hadn't even known who the old woman was. Paige didn't look back at him. She stood there, her hand held tightly in Dorothy's, her eyes lowered to her own fingers. Calloused hands, nails cut short, an old burn mark on the back of her right hand. She didn't know where to look in a room full of people in suits and jewelry, a room where she didn't belong. All she knew was that the old woman was holding her hand very tightly, and that was the only thing keeping her still, instead of turning and running for the rear door. Dorothy said nothing more. She had said enough. She led Paige through the crowd, past the faces watching them, past Kendall, who still stood frozen in place, and over to the VIP table at the very center of the hall. She pulled out a chair for Paige and seated her beside her. At the table, everyone in the room knew belonged to the Cross family. Then Dorothy sat beside her, still holding the girl's hand, as if Paige were her own granddaughter, lost for many years, and finally found. Remington stood behind his mother's chair, watching the scene, and he understood that his mother had just done something no one in that room would have dared to do, not even him. She had just declared before the entire upper world of Denver that this kitchen assistant was under her protection, and when Dorothy Cross protected someone, that meant Remington Cross protected that person too, whether he wanted to or not. The party went on. The music rose again. Glasses were lifted again. But no one in the hall forgot what had just happened, especially not Kendall Ashford, who withdrew to a corner of the room with a smile returned to her lips, though her eyes weren't smiling. After that night, Remington called Wyatt into his office. "Find out about that girl. Everything. From the day she was born to the dog she once owned." Wyatt brought back a thin, clean file, without a single stain on it. Dorothy called her son to her house the next morning and informed him that she would be hiring Paige as her caretaker. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an announcement. Remington agreed, but he assigned Wyatt to keep watch, installed security cameras around the house, and stationed a man nearby 24/7. Before stepping out, he said to Wyatt, "If my mother wants to take in a stray cat, I'll let her. But if that cat scratches her even once, I'll handle it." After Paige had been in Dorothy's house for 2 weeks, she began to grow used to the rhythm of life there. Every morning, she woke early to make porridge for Dorothy, brewed the exact kind of tea the old woman liked, and then the two of them sat at the kitchen table, talking while the morning sun poured through the glass doors. Dorothy often told stories from long ago, about the years when she was still a seamstress in a small workshop on the outskirts of town, about the first time she met her husband, when he walked into the tailor shop to order a suit, and she had to measure him 3 times because her hands were shaking. She told those stories in a gentle voice, sometimes laughing softly, and Paige sat and listened without interrupting, because she knew what it felt like to need someone to hear you. Dorothy didn't ask Paige much about her past. She asked what Paige liked to eat, whether she slept well, whether she was cold. Small questions, the kind Paige still wasn't used to anyone asking. One afternoon, Paige was washing vegetables in the kitchen when Dorothy walked in. She sat down in the chair beside the kitchen table, watched Paige work for a while, then said, "Come sit with me." Paige dried her hands and sat across from her. Dorothy took both of Paige's hands, turned them over, and looked at them. Calloused hands, dry skin cracked at the fingertips. The old burn on the back of her right hand faded into a pale scar. They were the hands of someone who had washed dishes, mopped floors, carried trays, and scrubbed pots for many years, without anyone ever looking down long enough to see them. Dorothy held those hands tightly in her own. Her hands were smaller, thinner, but warm. She looked at Paige and spoke very softly, as if she were afraid that speaking too loudly would break the sentence apart. "From now on, no one gets to hurt you anymore. I'm here." Paige didn't cry. She had learned a long time ago how not to cry in front of other people. But her eyes reddened, and she had to look away for a while before she could look back at Dorothy. Because in 27 years, no one had ever said that to her. Her grandmother had loved her, but her grandmother hadn't had the strength to protect her. She could only hold Paige when she cried, and then she too had gone away. But Dorothy was sitting here now, holding her hands, telling her that she would be here. Paige didn't know whether Dorothy could keep that promise, but the simple fact that someone had said those words to her was enough to make her bite her lip hard to keep herself together. That afternoon, Remington came to visit his mother. He stepped into the kitchen and saw Paige wiping the table while Dorothy sat reading a book. He didn't greet Paige. He sat down in the chair across from her, rested his elbow on the table, and took a check from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He placed it on the tabletop, directly in front of Paige, then pushed it toward her. $200,000. Paige looked at the number on the paper, and she understood immediately. It wasn't a gift. It was the price she was supposed to accept for leaving this place. "I heard you owe $60,000 in medical bills," Remington said, his voice flat and even, neither rising nor falling, the same voice he had used with Harlan in the VIP room that night. "This is $200,000. Enough to pay your debt, enough to move, enough to start over somewhere else. You take this money, leave my mother's house, and we never have to see each other again." Dorothy looked up from her book and watched her son. She didn't say anything. She only looked, and in her eyes there was something Remington chose not to see. Paige looked at the check, $200,000, more than all the money she had earned in the past decade combined, enough to pay off her grandmother's debt, enough to leave the basement apartment, enough for her to stop counting loose bills every night before she went to sleep. Her fingers touched the edge of the paper, just one light touch. Then she stopped. She pushed the check back toward Remington. Slowly, without anger, without wounded pride, she looked straight into his eyes and said, "You think everyone has a price because in your world everyone does. But I don't live in your world. I'm here because Mrs. Dorothy needs someone to talk to her, not because I need your money." Then she stood, turned her back, walked to the sink, and continued washing dishes. Her back was straight, her hands still moving steadily, as though the most powerful man in Denver didn't exist behind her. Remington looked at the check lying on the table. He looked at it for a while, then folded it, slipped it back into his pocket, and stood. He walked to the kitchen door and stopped on the threshold. His back was turned to Paige. He stood there for a few seconds, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. In his world, money was the strongest language. He had just spoken in that language, and this girl hadn't understood it, or rather, she had understood it, and refused to accept it. And he had no other language. He left without saying another word. Dorothy watched her son go, then looked over at Paige standing at the sink, her back still straight, her hands still washing dishes. Dorothy said nothing, but she smiled, very faintly, as if she had just seen something in this girl that her son wasn't wise enough yet to recognize. One weekend afternoon, Paige was hanging towels in the backyard of Dorothy's house when she heard a small cry drifting from the garden. It was a weak little sound, not violent or loud, like the cry of a child trying to call for someone when no one was answering. Paige set the basket of towels down and walked toward the sound. She found the little boy sitting behind a rose bush near the far end of the garden, his face red, tears running down his cheeks, both arms wrapped around his knees. He was the young son of the gardener, about 4 years old, who had followed his father out to play in the garden and then lost him somewhere in the wide stretch of green. The child looked up when he saw Paige, his eyes soaked, his lips trembling. Paige didn't stand over him and look down. She lowered herself to the ground, bringing herself to his eye level, then gave him a gentle smile. "Your daddy's nearby. Let me take you to find him, okay?" She spoke in an ordinary voice, not panicked, not loud, as if this were something very simple. The child looked at her for a while, then nodded. Paige held out her hand. The little boy took it, and the two of them walked along the garden path until they found the gardener frantically searching for his son at the other end. The child ran to his father, hugged him, laughed, and forgot at once that he had just been crying. Paige stood watching, nodded to the gardener, then turned back to finish hanging the towels. Dorothy stood at the kitchen window and saw everything. She said nothing at the time. But that evening, when Remington came to visit, she sat across from her son in the living room and told him what had happened. She didn't make it long. She only said, "That girl has an instinct to protect those weaker than herself." She saw a little child crying, and she sat down right away, without thinking, without calculating. Calculating people don't do that. Only people who are good deep in their bones do that. Remington listened and said nothing. He finished his cup of tea, then stood and left. But as he drove through the streets, he remembered the way Paige had lowered herself to the child's eye level, and he couldn't understand why that tiny detail stayed with him for so long. Kendall Ashford couldn't forget the night of the party. She couldn't forget the feeling of standing in the middle of the Obsidian's hall, being looked at by Dorothy Cross with those eyes, in front of 300 people. She also couldn't forget the sight of Paige seated at the VIP table, right in the place Kendall had spent 2 years struggling just to sit near. Kendall hid her anger very well. It was a skill she had learned after years of living in the world of powerful men. But she couldn't hide from herself the fact that the kitchen assistant was taking a place Kendall considered her own, Dorothy Cross's trust. Kendall began digging. She had her own people, her own connections, and enough money to buy information. It didn't take long for her to find Paige's past, the medical debt, and the girl's financial situation. Kendall printed out the debt records and had someone send them anonymously to Dorothy's house in a white envelope, along with one handwritten line. "This girl approached you for money. Ask her how much she owes." Dorothy received the envelope in the morning. She opened it, read it, then folded it again. She wasn't angry. She called Paige into the living room, placed the paper on the table, and asked directly, "Someone sent this to me. Tell me." Paige looked at the paper. She recognized her own debt records. She didn't turn pale, didn't stammer, didn't try to explain in circles. She looked at Dorothy and said, "I owe money for my grandmother's medical bills. That's true, but I've never asked anyone for money, including you. If you think I'm here because of money, I'll leave right now." After saying it, she stood still, her back straight, her eyes looking directly at Dorothy. No begging, no excuses, only the truth, laid on the table, with the decision left to Dorothy. Dorothy looked at Paige for a long time. Then she picked up the paper and tore it in half. Slowly, firmly, right in front of Paige. "Anyone who wanted to trick me out of money would have hidden this, not spoken about it straight to my face the way you just did." She laid the 2 torn pieces of paper on the table and stood. "Go make lunch. I want squash soup today." Paige stood there for a few more seconds, looking at the 2 torn pieces of paper on the table, then turned and went into the kitchen. She didn't say thank you. because she knew Dorothy didn't need to hear it. And she also knew that someone out there was trying to push her out of this house, and that person wouldn't stop at one envelope. Kendall heard from her people that Dorothy hadn't been shaken at all. She sat in her office on the 12th floor of the corporate building, staring out through the glass, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. A gentle strike had done no good. Dorothy trusted that girl more than Kendall had thought. Then she would have to play another way. Kendall opened her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and stopped at one name. She didn't call right away. She set the phone down, thought a little longer, then smiled faintly. The kind of smile worn by someone who had just found the next move on a chessboard her opponent didn't even know they were playing. Wyatt called Remington on a weekday evening, his voice more clipped than usual. Someone's been taking pictures of Mrs. Dorothy's house. 2 days in a row. Black sedan, fake plates, parked at the corner across the street. Remington was sitting in his office at the Obsidian. He didn't ask him to repeat it. He stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds, then said, "Increase the men at my mother's house, 24/7, and find me the answer to one question. How did anyone get my mother's address?" That question was what truly made Remington's face go cold. Dorothy's house wasn't listed in any corporate record. That address existed only in the minds of the people closest to him, the people Remington trusted with his life. If someone outside knew it, there was only one possibility. Someone on the inside had sold the information. It took Wyatt 4 days to trace it. He checked everyone inside the trusted circle, every call, every meeting, every smallest financial transaction, and the name that appeared at the end of the line made even Wyatt pause for a breath before reporting it. Barrett. The man who had followed Remington's father from the earliest days of building the empire. The man Remington had called uncle throughout his teenage years. The man he trusted as much as his own right hand. Barrett had sold Dorothy's address to Gordon Mercer, the boss of North Denver, in exchange for money and a promise of protection when Gordon expanded his territory south. Remington received the news from Wyatt without changing expression. He only said, "Bring Barrett to the Obsidian. Tonight. Private room." Barrett walked into the VIP room at 10 o'clock that night. He was still wearing the same kind of shirt he wore every day, still nodding to Remington the way he always had. He didn't know yet. Remington sat at the head of the table, a stack of papers in front of him. He gestured for Barrett to sit, then began placing each sheet on the table, slowly, one by one, copies of messages between Barrett and Gordon's men, transfer records into Barrett's wife's account, photographs of Barrett meeting a stranger at a cafe outside the city. Each page fell onto the tabletop like a card, and with every page, Barrett's face turned a little paler. When the final sheet lay on the table, Barrett lowered his head. He began to speak, his voice shaking, tangled between apology and excuse. He talked about pressure, about money, about family, about the fear he felt when Gordon Mercer started tightening his grip. Remington listened. He listened to all of it, without interrupting, without changing his posture. Only when Barrett had finished, tears running down the face of a man nearing 60, did Remington speak. "My father saved your wife in 2014, when she needed surgery and didn't have insurance. I've kept your son safe for the last 4 years, when the streets weren't safe for anyone carrying the name of a person in this house. Do you remember?" Barrett nodded, his lips pressed tight. "I remember," Remington said. "That's why I'm letting you go. Take your family and leave Denver before morning. If I see your face again, I won't have a reason left to be merciful." Barrett stood. He wanted to say something more, but when he looked into Remington's eyes, he understood there was nothing left to say. He walked out of the room, the door closed, and 20 years of loyalty ended in less than 15 minutes. Remington remained alone. The VIP room was silent, with only the ticking of the clock on the wall. He didn't drink. He didn't call Wyatt in. He sat there, both hands resting on the table, staring at the stack of evidence without truly seeing anything. Barrett wasn't the first person to betray him, but Barrett was the one who reminded him of his father the most, and now even that memory had been stained. He drove away from the Obsidian at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. He didn't go back to his own house. He drove to his mother's, along the road he had known by heart since he was a child, the same road his father had once driven whenever the world outside became too heavy. He stopped the car in front of the gate, turned off the engine, sat there for a while longer, then stepped out. The house was dark. Dorothy was asleep. Remington opened the kitchen door with his own key, stepped inside, and didn't turn on the light. He sat down at the kitchen table in the darkness. both hands resting on the wooden surface his mother used to knead dough every morning. Soft footsteps sounded on the stairs. Paige had heard the noise from the spare room where she slept. She came down and saw Remington's shadow sitting in the dark kitchen. She didn't ask why he was there. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't turn on the light. She went to the stove, lit a low flame, and warmed the pot of squash soup left from dinner. She poured the soup into a bowl, placed it in front of him with a spoon, then sat down in the chair across from him. No one said anything. The kitchen was dark, with only the small glow from the gas flame flickering up against the ceiling. Remington picked up the spoon, scooped up the soup, and ate. He ate slowly, one spoonful at a time, and he finished that bowl of soup without needing to guard himself against anyone, without checking, without doubting, without wondering what the person sitting across from him wanted from him. Paige sat there, both hands resting on her lap, her eyes looking out the kitchen window where darkness covered the garden. She didn't need him to speak. She didn't need to know what had happened. She only sat there, and her quiet presence was enough. Remington set the bowl down. He looked at Paige in the darkness, longer than he had meant to, then stood and walked toward the kitchen door. He didn't say thank you. He didn't know how to say those words to someone he still couldn't place into any category inside his mind. A few days later, Remington stopped by his mother's house in the afternoon. Dorothy was taking her nap. Paige stood at the sink, her back turned to the living room. Remington stepped into the kitchen, leaned back against the cabinet, crossed his arms, and watched her. Then he asked, his voice light, as though the question didn't matter. "You never wonder what I do?" Paige didn't turn around. Her hands were still washing vegetables under the running water. "Your business is yours to know. No more, no less." She wasn't curious, wasn't judging, wasn't interested. She said it in a flat, calm voice, as if she were talking about the weather, and that was what made Remington stand there for a few more seconds without knowing what to do. In his world, everyone needed him. For money, for power, out of fear. Paige needed none of it, and he had no way to control a person who wanted nothing from him. He walked out, got into his car, and drove away. The whole way from his mother's house back to the Obsidian, he didn't turn on the music. It was an old habit from when his father was still alive. Whenever his mind wouldn't settle, he let the car stay silent and drove. Just drove, until the thoughts in his head stopped spinning. Tonight, the thoughts in his head did not stop. The call came at 2:00 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Paige was preparing dinner in the kitchen when she heard Dorothy call from the living room, her voice weak and strange, nothing like the way she sounded every day. Paige ran out and saw Dorothy sitting in the chair, one hand clutching her chest, her face pale blue, sweat beading across her forehead. Paige didn't panic. She laid Dorothy on her side on the sofa, called for an ambulance, then sat down beside her, holding her hand and speaking softly until the vehicle arrived, exactly the way she had done on the sidewalk 3 months earlier, except this time she knew who Dorothy was, and this time she was 100 times more afraid. The ambulance took Dorothy to the hospital. Paige went with her, sitting beside her in the vehicle, her hand never leaving Dorothy's. When they arrived, Dorothy was taken straight into the emergency room, and Paige was stopped in the hallway. She stood there alone, in her house clothes, her hands still dusted with flour from the unfinished meal. Remington received the news from Wyatt 20 minutes later. He was at the Obsidian, in the middle of a meeting with 3 partners. Wyatt walked in, bent down beside his ear, and said exactly one sentence. Remington stood up in the middle of the meeting without offering a single word of explanation. He walked out, got into the car, and drove straight to the hospital at a speed that made Wyatt, sitting in the passenger seat, grip the handle tightly. When Remington arrived, he locked down the entire floor. He didn't need to ask whether anyone had the authority to do that. He made calls, gave orders, and within 30 minutes, the hospital floor where Dorothy lay held only the medical staff, Wyatt, Remington, and no one else. The chief doctor met Remington privately in the hallway and told him plainly that Dorothy had suffered a severe heart attack, needed surgery immediately, that the risk was high, and that without the operation, she wouldn't survive. Remington listened, his face unchanged. He nodded, signed the surgical consent forms, and then the doctor went in. The operating room door closed. The red light came on, and Remington Cross, the man who controlled everything in his life, stood before that door and realized he controlled nothing. No envelope of evidence, no command, No amount of money in the world could walk through that door and keep his mother alive. For the first time in his life, he was facing something all his power couldn't touch. He sat down on the plastic chair outside the hallway. A white plastic chair, cheap, cold, hard, exactly like every hospital chair in the world. He lowered his head, his elbows braced on his knees, his hands clasped together. Wyatt stood beside him, silent, waiting. Then Wyatt asked, his voice low, "What do you need?" Remington didn't lift his head. His voice was hoarse, low, completely different from any voice Wyatt had ever heard from him. "Call that girl here." Wyatt didn't ask which girl. He knew. He turned away and made the call at once. Paige arrived at the hospital close to midnight. She had gone back to Dorothy's house to get things for her, changed her clothes, then returned. She stepped into the hallway of the sealed hospital floor, walked past Remington's men standing guard, and no one stopped her, because Wyatt had called ahead. She walked down the long corridor, under the white neon lights, through the smell of antiseptic and the steady beeping of machines behind closed doors. Then she saw him. Remington was sitting on the plastic chair, his head lowered, his hands clasped tightly together, his shoulders slightly bent. He didn't look like a boss at all. He looked like a child sitting there, waiting for someone to tell him that everything would be all right, except there was no one to say it. Paige walked over. She didn't ask how things were. She didn't ask what the doctors had said. She looked at his tightly clasped hands, then sat down in the plastic chair beside him. Slowly, she reached out with both hands and placed them over his clenched ones. Her hands were smaller, rougher, but warm. She didn't say anything. She only left her hands there, resting over his, and sat still. Remington didn't pull away. He, the man no one dared touch unless he allowed it, the man the whole Denver underworld knew to keep its distance from, sat there and let the hands of a serving girl rest on his own. He didn't say thank you. He didn't look at her, but he didn't pull his hands away. And that was more than any words he had ever spoken. They sat there, two people in two plastic hospital chairs, in the cold white hallway, waiting. 1 hour. 2 hours. Paige didn't let go. Remington didn't pull away. From time to time, she felt his hands tighten a little, then loosen again, as if he were trying to control something inside himself that he wasn't used to controlling. The operating room door opened close to 4 in the morning. The doctor stepped out, removed his mask, and said, "She made it. The surgery was successful. She needs rest, but she'll be all right." Remington stood. He withdrew his hands from Paige's, nodded to the doctor, then walked straight into his mother's room. The door closed behind him. Paige remained alone on the plastic chair, looking at the closed door, and she let out a long breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. She stood, walked down the hallway, and turned into the stairwell. The hospital stairwell was empty, cold, the neon light above flickering on the upper landing. She sat down on the step, wrapped both arms around her knees, and cried. No sobbing, no one watching, only tears running down her face in the silent stairwell at 4 in the morning. She wasn't crying because Dorothy had nearly died. She was crying because she realized she loved that old woman, truly loved her, with the kind of feeling she had tried not to let herself have since the day her grandmother died. She had promised herself she wouldn't get attached to anyone again, because everyone she loved left, and each time she lost someone, she had to stitch herself back together from the place where she had torn. But Dorothy had entered her life so gently, so naturally, that Paige hadn't had time to build a wall against her. Now she was sitting here, crying in a hospital stairwell, and she understood that she had let someone in, and she was afraid, more afraid than anything, that she would lose again. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, took a deep breath, then stood and went back to the hallway. When she stepped out of the stairwell, Remington was standing at the door of Dorothy's room, having just come out. He looked at her. She looked back. Her eyes were red, her lids slightly swollen, and even though she had wiped away the tears, he still saw them. He didn't ask where she had gone. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He only looked at her reddened eyes, and he understood, without asking, that this girl had cried for his mother, and she had cried alone, because she never let anyone see her weak. He stood there for one more breath, then gave a very small nod, as if he had just acknowledged something he couldn't bring himself to put into words. Dorothy stayed in the hospital for 1 more week after the surgery. Remington divided his men between the hospital and his mother's house, but most of the force stayed at the hospital because that was where Dorothy was. There were still men watching Dorothy's house, but fewer than usual, only 1 man at the gate and the security cameras. Paige stayed behind to look after everything for Dorothy, making porridge to bring to the hospital every morning, then coming back home to clean, do laundry, and keep the house exactly the way the old woman liked it. She slept in the spare room downstairs, alone in the large house, and every night before bed, she checked the locks twice, out of the habit of someone who had lived too long by herself in unsafe neighborhoods. On the fifth night, around 2 a.m, Paige was asleep when she heard a noise upstairs. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the old house creaking. It was footsteps, light but clear, and the scrape of metal against metal, like someone trying to pry something open. She lay still, eyes open, heart beating fast, but she didn't make a sound. The survival instinct of a girl who had lived alone for years in a poor neighborhood told her not to run out, not to scream, not to do anything that would let them know she was there. She reached for the phone on her nightstand, opened a message, and sent Wyatt 2 words, "Someone's here." Then she slid out of bed, opened her bedroom door as quietly as she could, slipped into the downstairs bathroom, locked the door from the inside, and sat down on the floor with her back against the bathtub, both hands wrapped around her phone. Upstairs, 2 men were searching Dorothy's old study. They were Gordon Mercer's men, sent to find a small safe that Malcolm Cross, Remington's father, had once left for his wife. Inside the safe were ownership documents for several assets Gordon wanted to control. They hadn't expected anyone to be in the house because, according to the information they had received, the house was empty. Wyatt received Paige's message and called Remington at once. Remington was at the Obsidian, 20 minutes by car from his mother's house. He didn't wait for Wyatt to gather the team. He set his glass down on the bar, took his car keys, and drove immediately. He reached his mother's house in 12 minutes, 8 minutes ahead of Wyatt's team. He stopped the car a short distance from the gate, entered the house through the rear kitchen door with his own key, and heard the noise upstairs. Remington went up the stairs. The 2 intruders were trying to open the safe and didn't notice the footsteps behind them. By the time they turned around, it was too late. Remington subdued them both before Wyatt's team could arrive. When Wyatt and 4 men entered 3 minutes later, they found Remington standing in the middle of the room, breathing hard, the 2 men on the floor, and the house secure. Remington went downstairs. He stopped in front of the bathroom door, where a faint strip of light slipped out beneath it. He knocked, lightly, then said in a voice completely different from the one he had used upstairs. Low, slow, almost gentle. "Paige, it's me. It's safe now." Silence held for a few seconds, then the lock turned. The door opened. Paige stood in the bathroom doorway, her face pale but her eyes clear. She looked him up and down, quickly, with the eyes of someone used to assessing a situation. Then her gaze stopped on his hand. "Your hand is bleeding." Remington looked down. The back of his right hand was bruised, scraped, with a small cut seeping blood. He looked at the wound and didn't know when he had been injured, because when he had driven here, when he had climbed the stairs, when he had charged into that room, he hadn't been thinking about himself. For the first time in his life, he had acted without calculating for himself first. Paige stepped out of the bathroom, went into the kitchen, and sat down on the floor with her back against the refrigerator. She didn't cry. She only trembled, lightly, steadily, the kind of shaking the body does when danger has passed and the adrenaline begins to drain away. Remington followed her into the kitchen. He took off his jacket, draped it over her shoulders, then sat down on the floor across from her, his back against the kitchen cabinet. He looked at her and said, "From now on, no one gets to touch you. I promise." Paige lifted her eyes to him. They weren't pale anymore. Something sharp and clear had replaced the fear. The look of someone who had just seen the truth without needing anyone to point it out. "You promise?" she said, her voice soft, but every word clear. "It was your world that came into this house." Remington didn't answer, because she was right, and he had nothing to say back. The next morning, when sunlight came through the kitchen door, and last night had become something to handle instead of something to fear, Remington asked Paige whether she remembered anything about the 2 intruders. She sat at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and recounted it in a voice so calm that Remington had to look at her again. The first one had a snake tattoo on his left wrist. The second one called someone before going upstairs. "I heard 3 words through my bedroom door. Thursday shipment." Those 3 words. Remington looked at Paige, and he understood that this girl, while lying still in bed and listening to unfamiliar footsteps overhead, had not only been afraid, she had observed, she had listened. She had remembered. In fear, she had observed better than half his team, men trained to do exactly that. Thursday's shipment was the missing link Remington had needed. It was information about Gordon Mercer's transport schedule, the thing he needed to complete the evidence file against Gordon. And that information had come from the girl sitting at his mother's kitchen table, drinking tea. That afternoon, Remington called Wyatt into his office at the Obsidian. He gave one brief order. Dorothy Cross's house, and anyone living in that house, was to be treated as untouchable territory, and the message was to be passed to every contact in the network. Wyatt noted it down, then asked one more question. Including the girl? Remington didn't lift his eyes from the file on his desk. Including the girl. 2 days after the break-in, Remington sent an invitation to meet Gordon Mercer at an Italian restaurant in downtown Denver, a place both sides considered neutral ground. The restaurant belonged to a family that had nothing to do with either side, and both camps respected that unwritten rule. Remington chose that place, not because he needed the protection of neutral territory. He chose it because he wanted Gordon comfortable enough to hear everything he was about to say, before realizing that comfort or no comfort, the outcome wouldn't change. Remington arrived 10 minutes early. He sat at the innermost table, his back to the wall, his face toward the door. Wyatt stood 2 steps behind him. 2 more of Remington's men sat at a table near the entrance, eating like ordinary customers. Gordon Mercer walked in right on time. 50 years old, salt and pepper hair, his body heavy, but his steps still light. The kind of steps that belonged to a man who had never trusted the ground beneath his feet. Gordon came with 2 of his men, one standing at the bar, the other sitting at the table across from the kitchen door. Gordon sat down opposite Remington, unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaned back in his chair, and looked at Remington with the smile he used for people he looked down on. "Long time no see, Cross. I hear you've been busy lately. Your mother's in the hospital. Your house got broken into. Messy business, isn't it?" He ordered wine, took a sip, then went on in a mocking voice. "Oh, and I hear your mother found herself a new little helper. She runs pretty fast when she's scared." Remington's face didn't change. He sat there, his back straight, both hands resting on the table, looking at Gordon with the flat, quiet eyes that anyone who knew him understood were more frightening than any rage. He let Gordon finish speaking. He let that smile remain on Gordon's face for a few more seconds. Then he placed a thick brown envelope on the table and pushed it toward Gordon. "Open it," Remington said, his voice as ordinary as if he were inviting Gordon to look at the menu. Gordon looked at the envelope, looked at Remington, then opened it. Inside was a stack of documents, evidence that Gordon had laundered money through 3 shell companies in 2 different states, copies of fake contracts, transfer histories, and on the final page, details about the shipment scheduled for the following Thursday, including the route, the time, and the name of the person in charge. It was the information Paige had overheard on the night of the break-in, and Remington had used it to trace back Gordon's entire North Denver transport network within 48 hours. Gordon read. The smile on his face faded page by page. When he reached the final page, he folded the papers, put them back into the envelope, and pushed it toward Remington. "You think these pieces of paper can scare me?" Gordon said, his voice still calm, though his eyes no longer smiled. Then he leaned forward, lowered his voice, and added one more sentence. "Your father tried too. Where's your father now?" The words fell onto the table like a knife. The restaurant remained noisy around them, but at that table, the air turned dense and still. Wyatt, standing behind Remington, knew the next 3 seconds of silence were the most dangerous 3 seconds he had ever witnessed beside Remington Cross. Not because Remington was about to lose control, but because in those 3 seconds, Remington was deciding how he would answer, and every possible answer carried a different consequence for the man sitting across from him. 3 seconds passed. Remington didn't frown. He didn't clench his fist. He didn't raise his voice. He only leaned forward, closer, and lowered his voice until only Gordon could hear him. "My father died because he trusted the wrong person. I don't make that mistake." He paused for a breath, letting the sentence sink in. Then he went on. "These papers aren't meant to scare you. Copies have already been sent to 3 different places. If I don't call to cancel before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, they'll be forwarded automatically to the FBI. You have exactly 12 hours to decide whether the South Territory is worth losing everything." Gordon looked at Remington. He looked for a long time. He looked into the eyes of a man almost 20 years younger than himself. the man he had considered an heir too young and too weak to keep the seat his father had left behind. And in those eyes, Gordon saw the thing he had underestimated for the past 5 years: readiness. Not the recklessness of a cornered man, but a readiness that had been calculated, weighed, and accepted with every consequence before Remington ever stepped into that restaurant. Remington Cross wasn't threatening him. Remington Cross was telling him what would happen, and giving him one last chance to choose. Gordon didn't say another word. He looked at the envelope on the table, then looked at Remington one more time, as if measuring again the size of an opponent he had misjudged for years. Then he picked up the envelope, stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the restaurant. Not another word. His 2 men followed. The restaurant door closed behind them. Wyatt stepped forward and stood beside the table. Will he pull back? Remington remained seated, picked up his glass of water, and took a sip. His face still hadn't changed, as if the past 15 minutes had only been a conversation about the weather. He has 12 hours, Remington said. If he's smart, he pulls back. If he's stupid, he loses more than the South Territory. He set the glass down, stood, and adjusted his cuff. Before walking out, he paused for a moment and looked at the empty seat across from him, where Gordon had just been sitting. Gordon's words about his father still echoed in his head, not because they had made him angry, but because they reminded him of what he had known since the day his father died, that in this world, trusting anyone was a gamble, and his father had lost because he placed the wrong bet. Remington had no intention of losing the same hand. The next morning, before 8 o'clock, Wyatt received the news. Gordon Mercer had withdrawn all his people from the South Denver area. No noise, no announcement, no further negotiation. He had simply vanished from the territory he had spent half a year trying to take, quickly and cleanly. Like a man who had just seen his opponent's cards and knew he didn't have enough in his hand to keep playing, Remington received the news in the car, on the way to the hospital to visit his mother. He read Wyatt's message, gave a slight nod, then slipped the phone into his pocket. He didn't smile. Victory in his world wasn't something to celebrate. It was simply something to record, before preparing for the next fight. A few days after Dorothy was discharged from the hospital and brought home, Paige began fitting together the pieces she had tried not to look at over the past several months. The break-in. 2 strangers searching for a safe inside an old woman's house. Remington driving there in 12 minutes and taking both men down with his bare hands. And then afterward, everything disappearing into silence, without a single police officer showing up. The men standing guard around Dorothy's house 24 hours a day. The way they nodded when Remington walked past. The way they straightened their backs, lowered their eyes, and never looked directly at him. The way people at the Obsidian said Mr. Cross in the kind of voice people used when speaking of something they both respected and feared. Paige wasn't stupid. She had lived in poor neighborhoods long enough to know when wealth came attached to something that didn't appear in any books. She had simply chosen not to ask, because she was here for Dorothy, not for Dorothy's son. But after the break-in, after seeing Remington standing in the middle of his mother's living room with blood bruising his hand and 2 men lying on the floor, she couldn't pretend she didn't know anymore. One morning, while Dorothy sat at the kitchen table drinking tea, Paige sat down across from her and asked directly, "Mrs. Dorothy, your son, what does he really do?" Dorothy set her teacup down. She looked at Paige, not surprised, as though she had been waiting for this question for a long time. She was silent for a while, then said, "My son does things I'm not proud of. But he isn't a bad man. He's a man trapped inside a world his father left behind. I pray every day that someday he'll be able to step out of it." Paige listened. She didn't stand up. She didn't say, "I have to go." She sat there, looking at the old woman speaking of her son with a love mixed with sorrow that only a mother could carry, and she decided to stay. Not because she accepted Remington's world, but because she understood that a person wasn't only the worst thing they had ever done, and Dorothy needed her here now more than ever. That evening, Remington came to visit his mother. He stepped into the kitchen and nodded to Paige as usual, but Paige looked at him differently. Not with the indifferent look she usually gave him, not with the rejecting look she had worn when she pushed the check back. It was a sad look, sad not because she feared him, not because she despised him, but sad because she saw who he truly was, and she pitied him for it. Remington noticed at once. He looked into her eyes and knew she knew, not because she said it aloud, but because the way she looked at him was exactly the way his mother looked at him every day, loving him, but hurting. Kendall Ashford didn't wait long. She had watched everything from a distance, from the night of the break-in, to Gordon's retreat, to the way Remington had ordered Paige protected on the same level as his mother. She understood that slandering Paige with false evidence wouldn't work. Remington was too smart, and he had already ignored the debt records she had sent to Dorothy. But Kendall had something stronger than false evidence. She had the truth. She asked to meet Remington privately in his office at the Obsidian. He allowed her in because Kendall was still an important, legitimate business partner of the corporation. Kendall sat across from him, not smiling, not performing, and spoke in the most serious voice she had. I have nothing against her. She's clean, I know that. But let me ask you one question. Have you thought about what will happen to her if you keep her close? Gordon's men just broke into your mother's house. They know she's there. Next time, they won't just be looking for a safe. You want to protect her? Then the best way is to push her far away from you. Kendall finished, stood, nodded, and walked out. She didn't need Remington to answer right away. She knew the seed had been planted in exactly the right place. And the most terrifying thing about that move was that Kendall was right. She hadn't lied once. Keeping Paige close to Remington truly did place her in danger. The break-in had proved that. And Remington, the man who lived by logic and control, knew Kendall was right. He hated it, but he knew. The next afternoon, Remington drove to his mother's house. He stepped into the kitchen and saw Paige standing at the stove, a pot of soup simmering softly over a low flame, while Dorothy sat in the living room armchair reading a book. It was a peaceful, ordinary scene, like every other afternoon, but Remington hadn't come to eat dinner. Get out of this house, right now. Paige turned around, still holding the ladle. She looked at him, searching his face for some sign that he was joking. There was none. His face was flat, cold, exactly like the face he wore in the VIP room at the Obsidian when giving orders to other people. Two of Remington's men entered through the front door. They said nothing and weren't rough, but the way they stood on either side of the kitchen doorway made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Dorothy heard him from the living room. She set her book down, stood, and walked into the kitchen. Remington? He didn't look at his mother. He looked at Paige. Pack your things and leave. Someone will take you back. Dorothy stepped forward, her voice rising. Remington, what are you doing? Mother, I'm protecting you. That's my job. Don't interfere. Dorothy stood in the middle of the kitchen, looking at her son. Her eyes reddened, not from fear, not from anger, but because she saw in her son a shadow she had prayed her whole life never to see again. She spoke slowly, one word at a time, as though each word were a stone she was placing on his shoulders. Are you protecting me? Or are you becoming exactly what your father used to be? That sentence hit Remington like a slap he hadn't seen coming. He stood there, his face hardening, his jaw tightening. His father, Malcolm Cross, had lived his whole life by cutting away anyone who could become a weakness. He cut off friends, cut off allies, cut off even the people he loved, because he believed a man who stood alone couldn't be taken down by anyone. And in the end, Malcolm died with only a wife he had pushed away all his life, and a son he had taught not to trust anyone. Remington knew what his mother was saying. He knew, but he didn't take back the order, because inside his head, logic was still stronger than feeling. If Paige stayed close to him, Paige would be in danger. Cutting her out was protecting her. That was the calculation he believed in, the calculation his father had taught him, and he didn't know any other way to count. Paige set the ladle down beside the stove. She untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. She didn't look at Remington. She walked past him to Dorothy and looked at the old woman standing in the middle of the kitchen with reddened eyes. Paige spoke softly, her voice not shaking, not angry, so calm it hurt. Mrs. Dorothy, the soup is on low. Please remember to eat on time. Don't worry about me. Then she turned away, walked out the door, passed between Remington's two men without looking at anyone, and disappeared beyond the gate. She didn't look back. Dorothy stood there watching her until the gate closed. Then she turned back inside, sat down at the kitchen chair, looked at the pot of soup Paige had just made, still simmering softly on the stove, and didn't get up to take a bowl. She didn't eat. She didn't speak. All afternoon. All evening. Remington stayed at his mother's house until nightfall. He sat in the living room and waited. Waited for his mother to scold him. Waited for her to shout. Waited for her to say anything at all so he could explain. so he could say he had done it to protect her, to protect his mother, to protect everyone. But Dorothy didn't say a word. She sat at the kitchen table beside the soup that had gone cold, and stayed silent. That silence was heavier than every curse he had ever heard in his life, heavier even than what she had said about his father, because at least when she spoke, he knew what she was thinking. But when she was silent, he knew she no longer wanted to explain things to him anymore, and that was the most frightening thing Remington Cross had ever faced. More frightening than Gordon Mercer, more frightening than Barrett, more frightening than any enemy outside. It was his mother's quiet disappointment. That night, Remington didn't sleep. He drove back to the Obsidian, went up to his office on the rooftop floor, and sat in the dark without turning on the lights. His mother's words circled inside his head like a cut that refused to heal. "You're becoming exactly what your father used to be." He had heard that sentence hours earlier, but it didn't fade. It sharpened with every passing minute, because he knew his mother hadn't spoken in anger. She had spoken calmly, slowly, one word at a time, and that was what made it frightening. A person who was angry could cool down. A person who was disappointed enough to stay calm might not come back. But Remington wasn't the kind of man who sat still with pain and did nothing. He dealt with pain the only way he knew how, by controlling it. If he had made the wrong decision, then he needed to know why he had been wrong, why the information that led to that decision had arrived at the right time, in the right way, and through the right person. His instinct, the instinct that had kept him alive in this world for the past 5 years, stirred awake. When someone handed him exactly what he wanted to hear, at exactly the moment he needed to hear it, that wasn't coincidence. That was calculation. The next morning, he called Wyatt in. "Find me the answer. Who was the first person to raise the issue of that girl being close to my mother? Who told me she was a risk? Trace it back from the beginning. Every meeting. Every time anyone mentioned her name in a negative context." It took Wyatt 2 days. He traced the timeline backward, from the anonymous envelope sent to Dorothy's house containing the debt records, to the private meeting Kendall had requested with Remington in his office, to the times Kendall had accidentally mentioned Paige during meetings in a voice of concern so skillfully disguised. Piece by piece, Wyatt put it together, and the picture that emerged was so clear that he wondered why he hadn't seen it sooner. Kendall Ashford hadn't manufactured false evidence. She hadn't lied. She hadn't needed to. She only had to do one thing: show Remington the fear he already carried, then let him act on his own. The envelope of debt records sent to Dorothy had been step 1, planting suspicion. When Dorothy tore the paper and didn't waver, Kendall moved to step 2, waiting until a real danger appeared. The night of the break-in, then walking into Remington's office and saying the exact sentence he needed to hear. Keeping her close is hurting her. She hadn't lied by a single word. She had only used the truth, turned it at the right angle, shown it at the right moment, and let Remington, with his mafia instincts, make the decision Kendall wanted him to make. Remington read Wyatt's report. He read it slowly, page by page, then set it down on the desk. He wasn't angry in the way he had been angry with Barrett. Barrett had betrayed him for money, for fear, for weakness, and that was something Remington understood and knew how to handle. But Kendall hadn't betrayed him. She hadn't sold information to an enemy. She had only manipulated him with his own fear. The fear that his presence would put the people around him in danger. The fear his father had lived with all his life and handed down to him like an inheritance no one would ever want. Kendall had seen that fear, pressed exactly where it hurt, and he had done the rest himself. He hadn't been fooled by false evidence. He had been fooled by himself. Remington dealt with Kendall that night. No noise, no public scene, no explanation. He made one phone call, gave 3 orders, and before dawn, Kendall Ashford was cut out of every corporate project, stripped of access to all company accounts, removed from the partner list, and erased from every upcoming event at the Obsidian. No one explained to her why. No one needed to explain. In Remington's world, when someone disappeared from the inner circle overnight without a word, that was the clearest sentence of all. Kendall realized it the next morning when she came to the office, and her key card wouldn't open the door. She called Remington. No one answered. She called Wyatt. No one answered. She called the corporate secretary and was informed that her position had been restructured. She stood in the lobby of the building, phone in hand, and understood that she had just been erased more cleanly than Barrett, because at least Barrett had been allowed to see Remington's face one last time before leaving. Kendall had not. But that victory did nothing for Remington. Kendall was gone. Gordon had withdrawn. Barrett had left. Every external threat had been handled, and he sat in his office at the Obsidian, alone in the middle of the night, staring through the glass where Denver's lights flickered below. And this victory felt exactly like defeat, because Paige was gone. She had returned to the old diner, the old shift, the old life, the old basement apartment, as if the months in Dorothy's house had never happened. And his mother still wasn't speaking to him. Each time he visited the house, Dorothy nodded, poured tea, sat across from him, but said nothing beyond what was necessary, and the emptiness between mother and son was heavier than any battle he had ever won in the streets. He had defeated every enemy outside, but he had lost the most important battle, the battle against the way he treated the people he cared about. And he had lost because he had used the same weapon his father had used all his life, cutting people off, pushing them away, keeping distance, calling it protection when it was really fear. Remington sat there until morning. He didn't drink, he didn't call anyone, he simply sat, and this time, in the silence of the empty room, he heard the thing he had spent years trying not to hear. The echo of himself, sounding exactly like his father, and he hated that sound more than anything in the world. Paige went back to the old diner as if she had never left. She called the manager, asked if there were any open shifts, and was taken back the very next day, because the diner was always short on staff, and no one asked why she had disappeared for several months, and then returned. She put on the old uniform again, tied her hair neatly back, and stood behind the counter carrying trays from 6 o'clock in the evening until 10 o'clock at night, exactly the way she had before. During the day, she still worked cleaning rooms at the hotel. At night, she returned to the basement apartment, cooked instant noodles, and counted money. The old loop began turning again, as if the months in Dorothy's house had only been a dream she had woken from. She didn't hate Remington. She had lived long enough to know that resentment used up strength and didn't pay debt. He had told her to leave, so she left. She had lived before she met him, and she would keep living after he was no longer there. The only thing that hurt her was Dorothy. Every night before going to sleep, she thought about the old woman sitting alone at the kitchen table beside the cold pot of soup, and she wondered whether Dorothy had eaten on time. But Paige didn't call, not because she didn't want to, because she knew that if she heard Dorothy's voice, she would go back. And she didn't want to return to a place where she could be pushed out at any moment by a man who thought cutting someone away was love. One Thursday evening, the diner was emptier than usual. Paige was wiping a table in the back section when she heard the bell over the door and looked out. A man walked in, tall, in a dark suit, his steps steady but unhurried. He looked around the diner once, then walked straight to the smallest table in the far corner, against the wall. The table customers usually didn't choose because it was cramped and too close to the kitchen door. He sat down, placed both hands on the table, and ordered a black coffee. Paige recognized him immediately. Remington Cross, the man no one in Denver's underworld dared to look straight in the eye, was sitting at the smallest table in a cheap diner on the outskirts of town, ordering a $3 coffee and waiting. She didn't go to his table right away. She kept wiping tables, carrying trays, serving other customers, as if he were an ordinary guest waiting for his turn. Remington sat there, drank his coffee, and didn't rush her, didn't signal for her, didn't show any impatience. He waited, and the fact that he accepted waiting here, in this diner, on this cheap plastic chair, said more than anything he could have spoken aloud. The diner closed at 10 o'clock. The last customer left. Paige took off her apron, tucked it into the employee locker, then walked to the front. Remington was still sitting at the corner table, his coffee cup long empty. She walked to his table and stood across from him. She didn't sit down. She looked at him and waited. Remington looked up. He didn't begin with an apology. He didn't say, "I was wrong." He spoke in a low, slow voice, the voice of someone saying something he had never said to anyone before. "I sent you away because I thought that was how I could protect you. Someone told me that keeping you close to me would hurt you, and I believed it, because it matched the way I'd always thought. Cut away the people close to you to keep them safe. That was what my father taught me." He stopped, looked down at the empty coffee cup, then looked up again. "But my mother was right. I was using my father's way, cutting off people I care about to keep myself safe, then calling it protecting someone else. My father did that his whole life, and in the end, he died with no one beside him. I don't want to end that way." When he finished, he fell silent. Not another word. No more explanations. No excuses. He placed everything on the table, the same way Paige had once placed the truth about her debt, in front of Dorothy, straight, simple, and leaving the decision in the hands of the person across from him. It wasn't an apology. Paige knew that. Anyone could say an apology. This was a confession that he was afraid, a confession that he had been wrong, a confession that he had seen his father in the mirror and hated it. What Remington Cross had just placed on the small table in this cheap diner wasn't an apology, but something far more costly, the truth about himself, something he had never given anyone before. Paige stood there, looking at him. She looked into his eyes long enough to see something she wasn't sure she had ever seen there before. A man who was trying. Not trying to control, not trying to win, but trying to learn again how to be human, how to trust someone without needing a calculation, how to keep someone close without turning her into a chess piece. She didn't forgive him. She wasn't ready for that. And she wasn't the kind of person who said she forgave when she hadn't truly forgiven. But she didn't close the door either. She looked at him for a while longer, then said, her voice light, almost ordinary, as if the two of them were talking about the weather, "The coffee's free. Next time, you have to pay." A short sentence. Not heavy, not dramatic, but Remington understood. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a door left slightly open, just enough for him to know that if he came back, she wouldn't lock it, but narrow enough for him to understand that he would have to step through it himself, in his own way. And this time he mustn't break that door. Remington nodded. He stood, left a bill on the table, far more than the price of the coffee, then walked out the door into the cold night beyond the small diner, and drove away. Paige watched his car disappear around the corner. Then she turned back, picked up the bill, looked at it for a while, and put it into the diner's shared tip box. She didn't keep it for herself, not because she didn't need it, because she didn't want to accept anything from him in money. If he wanted to come back, he would have to bring something else. Dorothy called Paige on a Sunday morning, her voice gentle and ordinary, as if nothing had happened. "Come to my house for lunch today. I'm making squash soup." Paige held the phone, standing in her basement apartment, and said nothing for a few seconds. She wanted to ask, "Will Remington be there? Did he agree to this? Am I safe if I come back?" But she didn't ask any of those questions, because Dorothy's voice on the other end sounded exactly like her grandmother's voice every time she had called Paige home for a meal, and Paige couldn't refuse a voice like that. "Yes, ma'am, I'll come." Paige arrived at Dorothy's house close to noon. She walked through the gate, past the familiar garden, and realized everything was still exactly the same. The rose bushes were still there, the chair on the porch was still there, and the smell of squash soup from the kitchen was drifting out just the way she remembered. Dorothy opened the door, looked at her, then took her hand and pulled her inside without saying another word, as if Paige had only been gone for one afternoon, not vanished from her life for weeks. Remington was already in the house. He was standing in the living room when Paige stepped in. The two of them looked at each other, and neither said a word. There was no added apology, no explanation, no dramatic moment, only a slight nod from Remington, and Paige nodded back, then went straight into the kitchen to help Dorothy set the table. Dorothy cooked the meal herself, even though Remington tried to stop her. "You just had surgery. Let me call someone to cook." Dorothy looked at her son with the look every child knew left no room for argument. "My kitchen. I cook. You sit down." 3 people sat at the kitchen table, Dorothy at the head of the table, Remington on the left, Paige on the right. On the table were a warm bowl of squash soup, a classic pot roast with potatoes and carrots, and fresh-baked dinner rolls. It wasn't the meal of a boss. It wasn't the meal of the rich. It was the meal of a mother cooking for her son and for the granddaughter she had claimed as her own. The meal was quiet. No one tried to make cheerful conversation. Dorothy ate slowly, now and then placing more food into Paige's bowl without asking whether she wanted it. Paige ate everything Dorothy gave her. Remington sat across from them, eating with the same hands that, weeks earlier, had been bruised and bleeding after subduing 2 intruders inside this very house, and he ate that meal in silence, the kind of silence that was warm, not the cold silence his mother had used to punish him over the past few weeks. When the meal was nearly finished, Dorothy set down her fork, looked at the 2 younger people sitting on either side of the table, and spoke. She spoke gently, not in the voice of someone giving a lecture, but in the voice of a person who had lived long enough to know that there were things only old people could say without sounding empty. I've lived long enough to know this. Power doesn't keep anyone beside you. Money doesn't either. I watched your father use both all his life, and in the end, he lay on his sickbed, with only me and you around him." She looked at Remington. "Only kindness keeps people. Real kindness. Not the kind offered in exchange for something. The kind of kindness like this girl." She looked toward Paige, sitting down beside a strange old woman on the sidewalk, without needing to know who that old woman was. No one said anything more. Dorothy stood, carried her bowl to the sink, and Paige got up to wash dishes for her. The two of them stood side by side at the sink, just as they had during those earlier months, as if the emptiness of the past few weeks had never existed. Remington remained at the table, watching his mother and Paige standing beside each other, and he watched longer than necessary, because he was memorizing that scene, the sight of the two women he had almost lost because of the way he handled the world. That evening, Remington returned to the Obsidian. He called Wyatt into his office, closed the door, and placed a list on the desk. The list contained every illegal transport route his underground empire was operating. Each route, each time, each contact point. Wyatt looked at the list, then looked at Remington. "Shut them all down," Remington said. "One by one. Move them into legal operations. Contact the corporate lawyers. Restructure the entire transport division. Put it all into the official books. Any route that can't be converted gets closed." Wyatt was silent for a few seconds. Then he asked, not because he doubted him, but because he needed to be certain. "All of them? Do you know how much income you'll lose?" "I know," Remington said. He looked out through the glass, where Denver's lights flickered below, the city on which his father had built an underground empire and, in the end, had kept nothing. "My mother asks me every day when I'll leave this world behind. Every day, for 5 years. I never had an answer." He turned back to Wyatt. "Now I do." He didn't say Paige was the reason. He didn't mention her name. But Wyatt had walked beside Remington long enough to understand that this decision didn't come from profit calculations or business strategy. It came from the night Remington had sat eating soup in a dark kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, from the calloused hands placed over his in the hospital hallway, from the sentence, "Please remember to eat on time," that a girl he had thrown out still said before walking through the door, from the free cup of coffee in a cheap diner, from all the small things Paige Holloway had left behind in his life without ever meaning to, because she had never tried to change him. She had simply lived as herself, and that self had shown him there was another way to live, a way that didn't require anyone to fear him, for him to feel important. Wyatt nodded, took the list, and walked out. Before closing the door, he turned back to look at Remington one more time, and on the face of Remington Cross's most loyal man was something Wyatt rarely allowed himself to show: relief. In the weeks that followed, the relationship between Remington and Paige didn't end with a kiss, didn't end with promises, didn't end with the two of them running into each other's arms under the rain. It didn't end, because it was only beginning. Slowly, carefully, through the times Remington stopped by his mother's house when Paige happened to be there, and the two of them nodded to each other without needing many words. Through the meals Dorothy cooked, with the three of them sitting together in the kitchen. Through respect being rebuilt one stone at a time over the ruins of prejudice, fear, and the habit of cutting people away that Remington was trying to let go of. Day by day, several months passed. Denver had changed seasons twice since the night Paige walked into the hall of the Obsidian by mistake, in a kitchen assistant's uniform. Everything had changed, and everything was still the same. Paige still worked 2 shifts, still lived in the basement apartment, still counted money every night, but the medical debt had grown smaller because Dorothy had quietly hired her as an official caretaker with a decent wage, and Paige accepted because it was money she earned through real work, not money from a check pushed across a table. She came to Dorothy's house every day, cooked, cleaned, talked with her, and a few times each week she saw Remington when he stopped by to visit his mother. They didn't say much. They nodded, exchanged a few short words about Dorothy's health, then each went on with what they were doing. No promises, no romantic moment, only a fragile respect being rebuilt day by day, through small actions no one needed to name. Dorothy turned 73 on a late autumn Saturday. She told Remington she wanted to celebrate her birthday, just a small gathering with family. Remington asked where she wanted to hold it. Dorothy said, in an ordinary voice, "At the Obsidian." Remington looked at his mother, slightly surprised, because she almost never set foot in that building. But Dorothy didn't explain, and Remington didn't ask further, because when his mother decided something, she had her reasons. On Saturday night, the Obsidian was rearranged for the birthday dinner, not a 300-guest party like the 10th anniversary night. Just one small area on the main floor, a few tables, fresh flowers, candlelight, and about 20 people Dorothy had chosen herself. Mostly people she knew from church, a few neighbors, the gardener and his wife and child, Wyatt and Remington. No business partners, no politicians, no press. Dorothy wanted an evening for the people she truly wished to sit with. Paige received Dorothy's invitation over the phone. "Saturday night, my birthday. Come all right? At the Obsidian." Paige was silent for a few seconds when she heard the name of the building. She knew that place. She remembered everything about that place. But Dorothy had invited her, and Paige didn't refuse Dorothy. "Yes, ma'am. I'll come." Paige didn't buy a new dress. She didn't have money for that, and she also wasn't the kind of person who changed herself to fit a room. She wore the cleanest clothes she owned, a simple white shirt, dark pants, her hair tied neatly back, and an old pair of shoes she had carefully polished the night before. She took the bus downtown, got off at the stop near the Obsidian, and walked the last stretch. She stood in front of the building, the glass entrance doors, the warm light spilling out, and inside the lobby, she could see the marble hall whose every tile she remembered, the place where, months earlier, she had bent down to pick up a napkin in front of 300 people, because a powerful woman had told her to do it. She stood there for a few seconds, and she understood. She understood why Dorothy had chosen this place. Not because Dorothy liked the Obsidian, but because she wanted Paige to walk into this place again, through the front door, with her back straight, not as a lost kitchen assistant, but as someone who had been invited. Paige took a deep breath, then stepped inside. She walked through the main doors, across the marble hall, across the exact place where she had once knelt. She didn't look down at the floor. She looked straight ahead. Her back was straight, her steps steady, and she walked not because someone cleared the way for her, not because someone allowed her to, but because she chose to walk in herself. She didn't need a $200,000 check. She didn't need a suit or jewelry. She didn't need to prove she belonged anywhere. She belonged to herself, and that was enough. Dorothy was sitting at the main table, surrounded by the people she loved. She saw Paige walk through the door, and she smiled. A gentle, warm smile. The smile of someone who had arranged this moment long ago and was now watching it happen exactly as she wished. She said nothing. She only smiled, and that smile said this was the real reason she had chosen the Obsidian. Remington stood beside his mother. He watched Paige walk across the hall, and he remembered. He remembered that first night, the girl in the kitchen assistant's uniform lost in the crowd, calluses still on her hands, her eyes lowered because she didn't know where to go. Now she was still herself. No suit, no jewelry, nothing changed on the outside, but the way she walked was different now. She didn't bow her head. She didn't search for an exit. She didn't need anyone to hold her hand and pull her to her feet. She stood on her own, stepped on her own, crossed the hall where she had once been humiliated, and she did it on her own 2 feet. Paige reached Dorothy's table and sat beside her. Dorothy took her hand and squeezed gently, the way she had done on the first night in this very hall. Paige squeezed back, 2 hands holding each other, one old and thin and fragile, one young and calloused, and between those 2 hands was something that money, power, and the entire Denver underworld could never buy. Kindness answered with kindness. Remington looked at the 2 women sitting side by side, and he understood that everything he had built in his life, this building, this empire, the name the whole city had learned to fear, none of it could keep the people he loved beside him. What kept them there was something a kitchen assistant had in abundance, and something it had taken him nearly a whole year to begin learning. Kindness without conditions, without calculation, without any check attached. Power can make people lower their heads, but it can't keep anyone sitting beside you at the dinner table after the lights have gone out. Money can buy almost anything in the world, but it can't buy the sight of a girl sitting down on a dirty sidewalk beside a strange old woman who had fallen in the street without needing to know who she was. The worth of a person doesn't lie in the clothes they wear or the money in their wallet. It lies in whether they stop when they see someone who needs help. It lies in a bowl of hot soup, poured at 3 o'clock in the morning for a man who has just lost faith. It lies in calloused hands placed over the hands of a man falling apart in a hospital hallway. It lies in the words, "Please remember to eat on time," spoken by a girl who had been thrown out but still worried about someone else before herself. Kindness is the only power no one can steal, because it doesn't sit in a safe or a bank account. It lives in the way a person chooses to treat another when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain, when being kind brings them nothing except the feeling that they have done what was right. Sometimes, that alone is enough. Enough to change the way a boss looks at the world. Enough for an old woman to find faith in people again. Enough for a girl who has nothing to walk through the front door of the most elegant building in the city. Back straight, eyes forward, needing no one's permission. That is the story of Paige Holloway, the basement girl who changed an entire empire with nothing but a handkerchief embroidered with the letter P and a heart that never stepped over people when they fell. If this story touched you, tap like so more people can hear it. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it today. And subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories. Because sometimes, the right story at the right moment can change the way we see life. How did this story make you feel? Which character touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We always read every line, and we truly want to hear the thoughts that come from deep inside your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Thank you for being here and listening. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.